Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Catholic politics in America. We're going to examine a couple of questions like what really is an intrinsic evil and what really is a lesser of two evils, because I think we've heard that discussed considerably so far this election cycle. And then I want to get into the, as I see it, the very narrow window that I call it, when it comes to the ethics of Catholic voting, and this is from the USCCB document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. So that's the plan this evening. But first, a little story. So there once was a guy who was polling really, really solidly, right? It was huge how well he was polling. And it looked like he was a shoo-in. Everything was going so good for him. And then ended up with some rumors floating around about him maybe doing some things in his past that wasn't quite as savory as everybody had hoped. And so before you know it, the tide turned completely against him, right? I mean, we thought he was doing so well. And then it came time for him to be elected, and by popular vote, unfortunately, rather than this guy winning, the crowd said, "Give us Barabbas," right? So even though we may be value voters, and even though we may think we know what the facts are, there are a lot of times where there's more than meets the eye when it comes right down to making that decision. So fortunately, God made the most of that situation, obviously, but that's where we can go when we don't really see the whole picture. So I want to talk about that picture. I want to talk about what that means when it comes to Catholic values and what we should really be considering as value voters. So if you look at the history of the Catholic vote in the U.S., it goes back really solidly to 1928's election. And this was a four-term governor out of New York named Al Smith. Now, Al had huge support from his town of New York. Obviously, a four-term governor, you don't do that. Well, can't do that anymore, but back then you could, and the fact that he was so popular led everyone to assume that he was going to be the next president of the United States. But what happened was, in 1928's election, Herbert Hoover won by a huge landslide. And if you look at the map, what's interesting in the electoral map, there was almost the entire country voting for Hoover, with this odd kind of support coming out of the southern states, which is kind of where we get the Dixiecrats that have kind of stuck around in that kind of blue dog Democrat sort of understanding. And then, well, of course, Al Smith was a Democrat, and so there's a huge entrenchment of Democrat voting from the Catholic perspective going all the way back to that. And of course, as Catholics, we understand that there are significant values in the Democrat Party that many Catholics appreciate, and this is why that support began there. The next candidate didn't come along until 1960, after that defeat for the Catholic candidate Al Smith, and that was John F. Kennedy. Now, in 1960, not only did we have a Catholic running as president, we also had televised debates that began in 1960, and we had a very charming, good-looking face for television guy in Kennedy that also seemed to have a good game plan, and so as it turned out, he managed to make it to the presidency. But there was still anti-Catholic sentiment even then, and I don't know if you know this story, but there's a lot of concern, and Kennedy even came out basically saying, the Pope will not dictate what I do as president, because this is what the concern was even in 1960 America, that we got a Catholic in the White House, that means Rome is running the United States, interestingly enough. So he had to come out and really kind of put this separation between him and his politics and his religion, and he had to make it very clearly stated in that time of election, just so he could actually get a popular vote, because there was such anti-Catholic sentiment and such concern. So that was 1960. Then what happened between 1960 and the next time that we see a Catholic on the presidential ballot was 2004 with John Kerry. Now, by this time, it's become pretty well entrenched that it's okay to separate your politics and your religion, because Kennedy kind of set that stage and really kind of began this sort of gold standard of, I can live this dual life. I can be a politician and represent my constituency. I can be personally opposed to certain issues, but when it comes to what I believe and what as I believe as a representative of the people and what I believe as a person of faith, those worlds are completely separate. Interestingly enough, I mentioned Al Smith a moment ago. In 2004, I'm pretty sure I'm right on this, Kerry was the only nominee not to be invited to the Al Smith fundraising dinner, which is generally the last time you see the candidates before election after the debates. He wasn't even invited because of his pro-abortion stance and because of the fact that they felt like the organizers of the dinner felt like there would be so much potential controversy with him there as a Catholic, right? Now, we saw the candidates at this recent Al Smith dinner, but we didn't have a Catholic representative at the dinner with that pro-abortion stance. So interestingly enough, it kept him away from the dinner because of the potential controversy there. And of course, he didn't win the election. So it's interesting where we've kind of, I guess, you could look at this as an evolution or we've devolved into this single issue concept as Catholics that everything is hinged on abortion, which there's a primacy, and I would not for a moment say that it's not an important and a vitally important issue. But the one thing that I keep hearing thrown around, especially this election cycle, is, well, this is an intrinsic evil, and there's nothing that the other side stands for that could necessarily be considered intrinsically evil. And I've heard that a number of times. Now, as I say this, I want you to understand my bias as a voter because I'm an independent. So I can't say that I buy either side of the political spectrum, hook, line, and sinker. I've made a choice to step outside of any sort of partisan politics. So I can, ideally, it's been very interesting watching debates so far this time because this is the first time I've always kind of had that independent slant, but this is the first time I've officially been an independent watching this election. So there's been an interesting degree of objectivity I've been able to hopefully maintain through this and kind of really watch all of this happen. But when we talk about, there's nothing that the other side, there's only one side that supports an intrinsic evil, I have to question that. I really have to question that because there are more intrinsic evils than abortion. This is clear. I don't have the catechism reference in front of me, but it's researchable. You can dig into this and you're going to find that things like rape is an intrinsic evil. Torture is an intrinsic evil. Murder is an intrinsic evil. Here's one that I love. Lying is an intrinsic evil. Just lying is an intrinsic evil. So when you try to delineate this and you say, well, there's one issue that is so much bigger and so much worse than all the rest, I think you've kind of already, unfortunately, you've disqualified what could potentially be good about a platform or a party just simply by making that decision. Now, I'm not saying that's a wrong decision. I'm just saying you eliminate everything else around you. So what I've had to do, certainly as an independent, is I believe in the intrinsic evil of abortion. I do. And so I look at the Democrat Party, especially someone that we have as a candidate this time who is pretty solid in her support of Planned Parenthood and the fact that she wants to see this organization continue to get funding and for abortions to continue. She's talking about repealing the Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment was enacted to prevent taxpayer funding to go outside of the U.S. for abortion, and she's been very clear on that. So for me, that says, okay, that immediately disqualifies this candidate from my opinion as I stand on this particular issue. But that doesn't say that all Democrats are evil. Right? It doesn't say that just because somebody represents this party, because there are pro-life Democrats. And it's unfortunate that we've gotten to this fever pitch of rhetoric in this election that we are actually judging an entire party or people who claim a partisan status as being people who support evil because of that. Now, this candidate, I think we can clearly delineate it. We could say, based on the policies, based on her voting record as senator, I think we could see that there are things that we have to be concerned about. But here's the other thing. Contraception, as Catholics, intrinsic evil. So we've had the other candidate say, well, I would still fund Planned Parenthood, but I don't want them to do abortions. So his stance seems to be, remove that and everything else is good. Well, aside from abortions, Planned Parenthood is a pretty solid distributor of contraceptives. And this is where people can go and get free stuff all day long. There's been no discussion about that when it comes to the intrinsic evil of contraception. So I think we're in a, it's the Odyssey, right? It's the Scylla and Charybdis. We've got a rock and a hard place here to navigate when it comes to really moving through this, because you can't tell me that there's a clean slate on one side and this horrible, terrible, immoral, whatever that's going to come out of the other side. So I think we've got to look at these issues very carefully. We've got to weigh this and we've got to think about what we're up against. Now, with that said, does that mean you can't vote for either of these candidates? It doesn't. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that at all, because we have to realize that as value voters, with the illustration I used a moment ago of choosing Barabbas, we still might not make the best decision, but we still have to vote with our consciences, with our informed consciences, and we have to say, what can we do to find the best way to navigate this? Now, for me personally, I look at this and I'm like, there are other options. I don't have to vote for either of these individuals in this election, and my vote will count for that person that I want to vote for, and it has nothing to do with a vote against or a protest vote. And I tell people all the time, do not let anyone belittle you into thinking that your vote for a third-party candidate is wasted. Because what can happen with enough support from third parties is we can begin to change the political machinery, which would be a beautiful thing to see when it comes to having a real option, someone who might be pro-immigration and want to see a path to citizenship for immigrants that are here, which we as Catholics believe. We also believe that health care needs to be afforded to every citizen of the U.S. This is a Catholic stance, while at the same time we want abortion to be eliminated. So someone could potentially hold all of those, and they're not going to fit into any of these camps. But I think it's interesting when you look at evil and you look at the intrinsic evil versus that which is just really bad. Like, I think we've got hung up on things like there are those who use death penalty as an example of an intrinsic moral evil, which there is still the caveat in the Catholic faith, even though we should never need it. There's never a time that in this, as St. John Paul II says in the Catechism, that is the quote from one of his earlier encyclicals, where he says, in this day and age of criminal justice system, it's all but unnecessary. But even then, we're not talking about an intrinsic evil from the standpoint of God can never be a part of that decision, interestingly enough. And that's basically the definition. So when you look at what is intrinsic versus what is simply evil, for instance, just war, we have this caveat as Catholics. That is not intrinsically evil to go to war, to defend a country, to defend a populace. We can certainly do that. If there's collateral damage and there are innocents that are killed, that is evil, but again, it's not an intrinsic evil that comes from that. So it's very interesting as we look at this. But the one primary definition is simply this: is God in that decision? Is God in that decision? If you look at situations where someone is deciding something from using ideally the moral criteria that we would use as Catholics, and God is not in that decision, then it becomes an intrinsic evil. And that's it. So, we named a few of them, but that's not an exhaustive list, because we could go and in our own lives, we should always look at these decisions that we make and say, is this something that we see grace at work in, or is it not? Now, some would ask, well, what about the death penalty? How is God at work in that? Well, fortunately, there have been conversions of death row inmates. That's happened. And that's the reasoning that's used behind the death penalty being a deterrent or a prescription, if you will, because there have been those who have converted before their death. So as odd as that sounds, that's where we kind of draw the lines of distinction here. But of course, with moral decision making, there are those three elements that always have to be at play. We have to examine the object. We have to say, is this object truly moral? We have to decide if our methods of making, the outcome that's going to lead to what we're, our ultimate objective, is that moral? And then are the actions that we're taking moral as well? So if you can add those up, and they're all completely moral, then you have a moral decision. Anything else could be perhaps morally flawed, but maybe not intrinsic evil, unless we can look at that and say, is God really in this equation? Which, interestingly enough, when you look at the list, contraception, I mentioned, we look at things like fornication, which is in there, which would include extramarital affairs, premarital affairs, sexual self-abuse, all of this, which I think when you look at the abortion issue, which is such a hot topic, we need to take a step back from that. We need to go even further back in that question of why is this so bad? It's because it begins generally with God being out of that equation, with God being out of that decision. And so therefore the result, when you see the ultimate outcome of what happens, is that life is then the result of the initial action is not wanted, or it's sometimes seen as a barrier or a block to someone else's life, and therefore it needs to be eradicated. So what I would like to see, quite honestly, is, let's look at, as Catholics, and this is happening right now. I think it's wonderful if you follow some of the movements on Patheos, you'll see this kind of coming out more and more. There's a real desire for a different type of pro-life movement, a pro-life movement that's going to look at these issues and say, how do we examine this from a point of real ethic, and not just a political construct that says, well, if you're Democrat, you're bad, right? If you're Democrat, you're evil. We can't even work with that equation. Now there are pro-life Democrats coming out and saying, no, we got to look at this differently, and we got to see how we can examine these issues and really work through them from a moral standpoint to find solid decisions and find the right decisions ultimately. So that's encouraging when we see that kind of movement afoot. But I think it's real important to understand what is an intrinsic evil and what makes it so, just so we can have those conversations, because we still have enough time between now and Election Day that you're going to hear that come up. Well, this party supports intrinsic evil, this party doesn't. Really? So let's talk about it, right? Let's examine that a little bit more. I think it's important. Which, be prepared for keeping friends on Facebook when you enter into those conversations. So there's this wonderful document that's called Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, which, if you haven't read, it's 40 or so pages. I've encouraged friends to read this during this election cycle, and that's the first deterrent. Like, oh my goodness, there's 40 pages, I can't finish it between now and the election. Okay, I'm sorry that you read so slowly, or that you have to watch your TV shows instead of reading this document. But it's worth every Catholic reading, which come on, I did watch Walking Dead, just so you know. Still recovering from that episode. But I found time to read this several times, quite honestly, because it's such an important understanding of why we vote the way we vote as Catholics. And the one thing that I've drawn from it, one, is back to what I said earlier. We can vote for either of these candidates. We could vote for either of these parties. Even if there's an intrinsic evil that's a part of that platform, we can morally make that decision if We don't decide to vote for the candidate because of the intrinsic evil. Now, I believe that I've got friends who are so pro-abortive that they want to vote for Hillary Clinton because of her abortion stance. I think I do. I think it's fair to say that I've got those friends who are so concerned about this hinge issue that they see that they're going to do everything they can to keep this as accessible and as wide open as possible. Therefore, they will vote for a party that supports that simply because they support it. As a Catholic, if you do look at the stats and you say, wait a minute, there could be policies put in place that would potentially deter maybe the demand for abortion because this particular party has more social services that would possibly do that, and you can place your vote with that confidence of trust that something good is going to come from that party platform, you didn't vote because of the intrinsic evil. Which is true on the other side as well. You got to weigh these things out and you got to say, why am I voting for this individual? Am I voting because they will ensure access of contraceptives, which we mentioned a moment ago? Or, you know what, they're going to be very firm on immigration to the point of mass deportations, which that's an affront to human dignity. So we've got to look at this kind of stuff and we've got to weigh it out and we've got to say, why am I really voting? Why am I making this decision? And I think that the soul searching that has to take place as we move through this process, even if we think we already have made up our mind, is so important to do because it's almost like a pilgrimage through this time of really looking at the decisions you have, praying through it, working through it, and going, why am I making this decision? Which is why I arrived some time ago and finally made it official, I guess 2 years ago when I renewed my car license and registration to become an independent, because I said, I am so through with the partisan politics, I can't do that anymore. So that was a personal decision that I made. So if you read this document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, something very interesting emerges out of this, and that is that there's a, I think most of us would say that we've heard this, non-negotiables, right? There's 5 non-negotiables supposedly, or 6, or 4, or like the list changes all the time. And well, no, it was Pope Benedict who addressed this. Well, you know, one document, well, it's a transcript of a talk from Pope Benedict. He mentions non-negotiables, and he's talking about clean drinking water and affordable opportunities for employment. You know, so I mean, that list is so all over the place. So when you hear that garbage of non-negotiables, that does not exist. I'm sorry, that list does not exist anywhere in Catholic moral decision-making or formative decision-making. It's just not there. It's simply not there. It's something that they're Catholic voter guides that are not necessarily endorsed by the bishops, and you're going to find these with Catholic names, and you're going to see the however many it is this election cycle, non-negotiables. Here's what Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship boils everything down to, and it's brilliant. And I've decided to kind of, I like visuals, I like to kind of create things in my mind that I can kind of go, okay, I see how this thing works. So what I did, I read this document, and it comes down to 4 platform issues. And those 4 are human dignity, the common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity. Now, if we take those 4, and this is what I kind of did with it, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna work with this concept of seeing these 4 as a doorway. So, and I think it's a very small doorway. I think it's because when you start looking at the candidates, you start looking at the parties, you start looking at the platform issues, and you go, okay, first, and this is where I like to look at, there's a hinge on this door, and that hinge is human dignity. Everything is hinged on that. We are pro-life as Catholics, not because we have a mission statement to save babies. That's not what it is. As much as we want to save babies. We're pro-life as Catholics because we believe in the dignity of human life. And so that hinge that's there on the dignity of human life is the one issue that we have to hinge that whole door that swings open on. But then the opposite side of that, where the latch would be, if you will, where the handle would be, the doorknob, this is where we find the common good. So if we have a candidate that in any way, shape, or form, or a party that in any way, shape, or form is diminishing the potential for human dignity and the common good, they're not going to fit through that door, right? They're not going to fit through that door just on those two issues. And then if you, as I've kind of decided to look at the top and bottom of that, and it's like a square in my mind, it's like this tiny little square door. And the top of that door is solidarity, with the bottom of that door being subsidiarity. Now, subsidiarity and solidarity, subsidiarity is all about the local, right? It's all about the absolute most granular decision that you can make. And that comes down generally to a family. That's how we see it. And can decisions be handled? You know, there's a reason why the parish priest generally, unless he's invited, doesn't go visit families to make decisions on how you're raising your kids, right? There's a reason why, because those decisions need to be kept in the family and they need to stay there. That's subsidiarity. There's a reason why Pope Francis doesn't come around and check in on all the parishes. What's going on in here? Well, you guys, that's a surprise. We're going to inspect things today. That doesn't happen because there's subsidiarity on the parish level that says, you've got autonomy, you've got local autonomy, local decision making. You can do it all here, and you need to do it here because now we got responsibility. We got responsibility on the family level. We got responsibility on the parish level. We should have responsibility on the state, on the city level, and the state level in government. All of this stuff should be built upon that lowest level of decision making. Then the opposite of that, like I said, is global solidarity. So, you know, when we have a candidate that is running for the office of president who doesn't know what Aleppo, Syria is, that's a concern. That should be a concern as a Catholic to say, wait a minute, this guy doesn't even have a foreign policy platform. He doesn't even know what this is all about when it comes to some of the greatest humanitarian suffering, and I would say some because I think there's plenty of it globally, but what's happening in Aleppo, Syria right now is a concern that we should all be focused on. And when a candidate doesn't understand that, it doesn't even have a concept of it, or when a candidate seems to think that maybe it's just more of the war machinery that's going to take care of this, or what, you know, we got to weigh all of that stuff out because that is not global solidarity. So what I see is this compresses these four platform issues, and I love the fact that the bishops don't call them non-negotiables. They just say, you know, here are the four issues we have to look at and we have to really consider when we're making a decision. That doorway narrows so significantly by those four platform issues that almost no one can fit through it, right? Almost no one can fit through it. And it reminds me of that scripture, the eye of the needle, that, you know, you gotta strip through this thing to get through. And no one is ever gonna perfectly fit through it who we're voting for, but can we fit through it, right? That's the question we gotta ask ourselves. Am I forming my conscience, as this document asks us to do? Am I praying through this? Am I truly finding a way to understand that my politics have to be hinged on these issues and have to be focused on this issue? And if we can do that and then come out passing through that door with a decision, I think we found a way to a moral path to truly making a decision as a value voter, as a Catholic voter, as someone who has a tremendous responsibility as a citizen to really look at what's out there, weigh it, and try to make those decisions.